You earned it.
A couple of weeks ago, I took a pilgrimage of sorts, visiting sites related to the enslavement of Africans in what became the United States. About 20 rabbis, cantors, and lay leaders of our movement embarked on this trip. It was a very intense 4-day journey. Although I think we all knew the general history of the enslavement of Africans in the New World, it's one thing to know about it, and quite a different thing to visit the places where it happened and to experience museums that vividly portray the horrors of this history. Similarly, I've never been to Auschwitz. I've never seen the most notorious killing camp of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. But I have, of course, visited Holocaust museums, the one here in Houston, the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and naturally also Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. These museums powerfully convey the horrors of what happened to our people, the European Jewish communities in World War II, in ways you cannot necessarily feel by reading a book. And so too, the museums that we saw on our trip graphically portrayed the inhumane and torturous treatment of Africans on this continent. In many ways, the voyage across the Atlantic for these Africans was the opposite of the Israelite exodus crossing the Red Sea. We escaped to freedom as we crossed the Red Sea. The army of our captors were drowned in the sea. But between 1525 and 1866, some 12.5 million Africans were stolen from their homeland and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to be enslaved in the New World. And about 2 million of those Africans never made it to the Americas. They drowned in the Atlantic Ocean, either because they were sick or weak or for some reason cast overboard. Crossing the ocean for them was not a trip to freedom. It was a trip to death or enslavement. It was not their captors who drowned, but rather 16% of the slaves, buried in the deep waters in unmarked graves. The Africans who came here were not uneducated nor unskilled. Many were skilled in construction and woodworking. Others were skilled in farming, various crops. They had homeopathic medical knowledge. And of course, they had a culture and religion that was indigenous to the various parts of the African continent from which they came. They used these construction and woodworking skills and knowledge to build amazing buildings for their enslavers. Much like our ancestors, the Israelites, built the storehouses of Pithom and Ramses for the Pharaoh of Egypt. They used their medical knowledge to treat those who became ill from various diseases. And their religious faith, whether ancestral or the faith their European enslavers taught them, gave them hope and strength to persevere and endure the unbearable life of slavery. And I imagine that our ancestors, the Israelites, also found comfort and hope from their faith in our Creator. One of the locations that we visited was the Whitney Plantation, an enormous 1,800-acre plantation bought by a German immigrant in 1752, 24 years before the American Revolution began in 1776. It is now a museum built on only 200 acres of the original plantation. And believe me, 200 acres is enormous. The 200 acres of land and the museum infrastructure was purchased and developed by a trial attorney from New Orleans named John Cummings. And he spent $8 million of his own money creating this museum, which opened to the public in 2014. The site includes some construction that's for architects is of particular note. A French Creole raised-style main house built in 1790, which was inhabited by the owners of the plantation. And other buildings include a pigeonnier or dovecote, which I understand is a sign of great wealth. Anyone who saw those dovecotes on the plantation would have known that the owner was a very wealthy person. It also had a plantation store and the only surviving French Creole barn in North America, also built in 1790. A detached kitchen Kitchens were detached in those days if they could afford it, because they generate a lot of heat. And in the summertime, you don't want that heat in the place where you're living. So it was a detached kitchen. And it also had slave dwellings, a mule barn, and an overseer's house. We walked through parts of the main house which demonstrated very fine workmanship, built by the slaves. They apparently took great pride in their craftsmanship, despite the fact that they were building it in the deplorable conditions of slavery and for the benefit of their enslavers. Just the way I imagine our Israelite ancestors took great pride in their work, building the store cities of Pithom and Ramses for the Pharaoh. Although slavery officially ended in the United States after the Civil War, it was replaced by Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, and other institutions of depredation. And there is also the intergenerational trauma of slavery and prejudice that continues to impact this country in many ways. So although we're going to celebrate Purim tonight and tomorrow, Passover is almost exactly 1 month away. And of course, we celebrate our liberation from slavery, especially on Passover. But we recall the Exodus from Egypt every day when we sing Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai as part of our daily liturgy. The liberation of our people from slavery is the foundational story of Jews all over the world. It's a powerful story that resonates with many other peoples, and as we know, especially with many African Americans. One of the lessons that we learn from our experience is to treat the stranger, the poor, the widow, the orphan, and generally those who are disadvantaged in our society with extra kindness and generosity, because we know the kind of trauma that people suffer in those situations. Many Jews played a significant role in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but we know there's still prejudice and bigotry in our society today, inequalities in education, healthcare, housing, and employment. So it's up to us to reinvigorate our relationships with our African American neighbors today. United Synagogue will also be exploring the possibility of making a pilgrimage like the one my colleagues and I embarked on, available to congregations across the country. But in the meantime, I think we should all consider taking trips like this so that we can better understand this history. Just as we hope that non-Jews will go to Holocaust museums to understand the horrors the Jews of Europe experienced, we should visit museums that provide a window of understanding of what happened to Africans who were brought in chains to this country. We began the book of Vayikra this morning, the book of Leviticus. And the book of Leviticus describes in great detail the kinds of sacrifices our ancestors would bring to the temple in Jerusalem. But since the temple was destroyed, our sages taught us that we do not need to sacrifice animals to God. In the words of the prophet Hosea, loving kindness I desire, not sacrifice. Acts of kindness to others are considered preferable to God than any sacrifices we might have made to our Creator. Acts of kindness also demonstrate that we recognize the humanity and dignity of another person. Acts of kindness create bonds of compassion and understanding among people. Acts of kindness can help to heal a world that has experienced so much trauma over the centuries. The Torah ends with the Israelites on the border of the Promised Land. They never actually enter the Promised Land before we start all over again with creation. Perhaps that is a reminder that there is always more that we need to do to achieve the goal of creating an ideal world in which everyone is recognized as a full human being, endowed by our Creator with the rights to life, liberty, and what I would say is the pursuit of Shalom, the pursuit of peace and wholeness in life. Shabbat Shalom.